Today is the 4th of July, the day we in the United States celebrate as Independence Day. It is a day when 245 years ago, Continental Congress signed the Declaration of Independence, formally stating their intention and reasons for separating from the British Empire to become an independent federation of states. I almost said free in describing these federations. But given that these states were intended to protect the freedom of wealthy white men to force Black men, women, and children to work until they died under the threat of torture, rape, and execution, to collect taxes and debts from poorer white men, to deny women the rights to the ballot box, finance, and control of their own bodies, and to commit genocide against Native peoples, freedom is perhaps not the best way to describe their intent. The founders of this nation were great, but deeply flawed human beings. Without them, we would not have the freedoms to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that we each enjoy today. I personally owe them my very existence. Without them, my Alsatian ancestors would have died in battle during the Franco-Prussian War. Without them, my grandfather's family would have likely starved to death during the Great Hunger in Ireland. Without them, my Huguenot ancestors would have been massacred in France. Without them, my grandmother's family would have been forced to remain as Republican targets in the IRA-dominated village of Castlebar. But at the same time, we must recognize that this nation was founded upon genocide and slavery. Even in the Declaration of Independence, we find the signers dehumanizing the Native people as merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages and sexes. Somehow, they managed to utterly ignore that it was the European colonists under Lord Amherst for whom the town to our northeast is named, who just a little over a decade earlier practiced germ warfare, deliberately killing untold numbers of men, women, and children through the gift of smallpox infected blankets. And our US Constitution not only protected the right of enslavers to continue to hold enslaved African Americans in bondage in labor camps throughout the South and in homes in the North, but also to further empower these enslavers by giving them greater rights at the ballot box because of the number of people that they held captive. Our nation was founded with great idealism, but by deeply flawed people who did evil things. It is this reality that we must all struggle with. How can good come from evil? And it is this reality that those of you who have been joining me in Bible study have been struggling with as we've been working our way through the first book of Samuel. You see, it is somewhat obscured in the reading we have today from the second book of Samuel, and the little snippets we have read over the past several weeks from the first and second books of Samuel. But David was far from a virtuous soul. He was a thief, a mugger, a rapist, a murderer, a cheater, and an all-around rather contemptible character. And the Bible really does nothing to obscure this reality, though the way we read it does. David was also God's chosen and anointed king of Judah and Israel. Under David, the 12 tribes were brought together into one kingdom. He united the southern tribes into a mighty army that, despite being smaller than the northern population, was able to defeat northern forces over the course of 7.5 years through cunning tactics and great charisma. So powerful was his army and his persona that, as we hear in our first reading, the people of the northern tribes called for him to be named king over them, despite the fact that Saul, the former king of the north, had living heirs. And then the elders, the leaders of the tribe, anointed him as king over them, in effect, practicing a primitive form of democracy. Under David, the tribes of the north and the tribes of the south together conquered Jerusalem from the Jebusites, despite its well-protected status at the top of a mountain, to create a capital city over both kingdoms on the neutral ground between them. This united kingdom and capital, from which David ruled for 33 years, and from which Solomon then ruled throughout his lifetime, was remembered as being the golden age of Israel and Judah for centuries to come, a time in which the Jewish people, the eternal underdogs of history, were united and had power over those around them. As a result, David is remembered with fondness and romanticism as God's chosen one and the ancestor of our own Messiah, Jesus. Without David, Judaism would not have survived. The tribes would never have been united, and Jesus of Nazareth would never have been born. David's existence and outsized personality and skills in battle were essential for the development and continuation of Judaism and Christianity, for God's plan in the world. But that God worked through the flawed person of David to bring God's plan into being does not erase the evils that David employed. Just as the great comforts and freedoms and even existence that so many of us owe to the founders of this nation do not erase the fact they were flawed men, practiced, proliferated, and profited from great evils against Black and Indigenous peoples, the poor, and women. God makes a way through the darkness and brings good from evil, but the evil is not erased, though the good can sometimes overshadow it. And so as we mark this Independence Day, it is important not to erase our history or ignore that the evils that undergird it and continue to be perpetuated even to our modern times. But it is also important to recognize that we have the freedom that those very flawed human beings who formed our nation preserved for us. The freedom to choose to right historical wrong, to create a better world for our children, and to walk in the light of God now and always, to see God's plan for the good of all through to its fulfillment. Amen